Gospels.
Passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. You know that Holy Week is my favorite time in the whole year. Ever since I was a little kid, I still have very fond memories when I was a little kid going to the different liturgies and devotions in Holy Week. The oldest I can recollect is when I was 4 years old, and I can still, even if I go back, I am from Mexico City, even if I go back to Mexico City, I can still locate the exact point in the street where my mom parked her Volkswagen and took me and my sisters to the church. That is the oldest recollection I have of Holy Week. I was 4. And I liked it. For some reason I liked it, even though, you know, masses are long and the liturgies are long, but for some reason I liked it. But when I was 10 years old, several things happened all together that made me really love for good Holy Week, up to the point of becoming even obsessed about it and trying to learn and learn and learn more about it every time. One of the things that happened was that I was lucky or blessed enough to sit next to my grandmother on every single liturgy. And I was lucky because she was carrying a missal all the time, and she let me read from her missal. And looking at the missal, I realized that it was not only the readings and the prayers, but I also realized that there were many notes written in red ink that said what the priest was supposed to do. And I started realizing that the priest was actually doing and moving and opening his hands and everything just as the missal said. So then I realized that everything the priest did at the altar had a purpose and had a meaning. Then I wondered, what's the meaning behind all this? And then what I started doing was cheating, so I would run further and see if the priest was actually going to do what the missal said. And yes, he did. So then I realized that I said, if this happens here, then all the priests in the world are doing exactly the same, then there has to be a reason for that. So that was beautiful, because that got me intrigued, and then I promised myself, you know, when I grow up and I work and I have my money, I will buy a missal. And I did. And I carry my missal all the time, every time I go, and I read everything that is, you know, really everything. So that was one thing. Another important thing was that for the first time, because we were little, so my parents didn't take us to everything, you know. For the first time, my parents took us to the Tenebre, the liturgy of the hours, the divine office in the morning. And they became in love with the divine office. So then I said, you know, when I grow up, I'm going to get myself a breviary, and I did. So I got my breviary and I got my missal, and that all came from when I was 10 years old, being with my parents at church on Holy Week. And then the most amazing thing happened on the Easter Vigil. We hadn't been at the Easter Vigil before, probably because we were too young, and I have 3 sisters and I am the eldest, so it was hard for them. So my dad said, you know, I'm going to take, you know, you and your sister, the next one, to the Easter Vigil. So we went to the church. It is a church that sits, well, actually it doesn't sit, but on Holy Week and on Christmas, I have counted 1,200 people, you know. All the pews are packed, and then there's people all around, and there's even people standing through the aisles, because it's like that. So we got there, and there was no place for us to sit, and it is a long mass, a long mass. And in Mexico, they always read the 7 readings. They don't trim it down to anything. It's 7 readings. So my dad said, I have to find a place for these 2 to sit, or we're not going to make it. And he was smart enough to go up to the choir. So he took us to the choir, and from the choir, I had the most amazing view of everything that was happening there. And I was sitting next to the choir, and the choir was led by a Franciscan priest, because it was a church run by Franciscans. And he was there with his habit, you know, conducting the choir and the organ and all that. It was the most beautiful thing ever. So since I was 10, I've been in love with Holy Week, and I have, for that reason, studied a lot about that, and everything I have found is so amazing that I just cannot keep it to myself, and that's why for many years I give these talks, wherever they invite me to, because this is a good opportunity for people to understand, because I'm sure that when we understand what is happening, then we truly participate on the different liturgies. So that's what we're going to do. Today we will focus on the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper that takes place on Holy Thursday. Then next Sunday we will focus on everything that happens on Good Friday, and then on Palm Sunday we will focus on everything that happens on Easter. That's what we're going to do. The first thing we need to understand is the date. Why is it that Holy Week is so late this year? Well, because our Christian Easter is based on the Jewish Easter, which is based on the lunar calendar. So the Jews celebrated and continue celebrating Easter, Passover. They celebrate, I have never understood that, and that's something I have never found why. Maybe you know, and if you know, you tell me. I don't know why English is the only language in which they call Passover to the Jewish one and Easter to the Christian one, whereas in the rest of the languages it is called the same. You know? So in Spanish it is Pascua, and in Italian it is Pascha, so it is always the same for both. But for some reason in English they make this distinction, and I think that actually breaks the whole point, because it's actually the same thing. And Jesus' Easter or Jesus' Passover gives plenty to the Passover of the Jews. So the Jewish Passover is celebrated on the first full moon in spring, which is the 14th day of the month of Nisan. In our case, we celebrate our Christian Easter on the first Sunday after the first full moon in spring. And the first full moon in spring is going to be later this year, so that's why this year, Holy Week is going to be a lot later than in the previous years. In the afternoon, at 5 o'clock, Lent comes to an end, and the Triduum begins. And the Triduum begins with the celebration of the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper. On this Mass, we celebrate three important aspects of our faith: the institution of priesthood, the institution of the Eucharist, and the commandment of law that Jesus gave to his apostles on his Last Supper in the Gospel according to John. And the readings of this Mass are intended to make us reflect on these three important aspects of our faith. And it is interesting to see how the first reading, which is taken from the book of Exodus, talks about the celebration of Passover, the celebration of the Jewish Passover. Why does that matter? Well, because when we read the Gospels, when we read the Synoptics, we see how Jesus sends his apostles, he actually sends two of them to Jerusalem to prepare the Passover, right? And that Passover celebration becomes the Last Supper Jesus has with his disciples. Because the institution of priesthood and the institution of the Eucharist and the commandment of love took place precisely in the Last Supper. So what we are celebrating in the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper is precisely the Last Supper of Jesus. But we are celebrating that Last Supper, the way we are celebrating it is as a memorial. And actually every celebration, every Mass is a memorial of the Last Supper, but that one in particular. And what is a memorial? A memorial is a liturgical way of recollecting something that happened in the past. Not just to remember something that happened in the past, but actually with the purpose of, by recalling it, make it present. And not only to make it present, but to make it present so that we can partake on it. So with those memorials, we keep things alive. And this tradition of celebrating a memorial was actually what was happening on the Last Supper precisely. Jesus and his apostles were celebrating Passover, and by doing so, they were making a memorial of the Passover of the Jews. And the first reading from the book of Exodus tells us the prescriptions given to Moses by God on how to celebrate the Passover meal. You remember when they were slaves in Egypt, and they were going to be finally, when they were going finally to be expelled now by the Pharaoh. You remember that story, right? The Pharaoh, he let them go, then he repented, and then he took 10 plagues, and then, or 9, and actually the 10th one was going to come, and then he himself was going to kick them out. Because the 10th plague was the worst. You remember that the angel of the Lord was going to pass through the city, killing the firstborns in every single house, right? So then God said, now you are going to be free. So to celebrate your freedom, you are going to celebrate this supper. And he even gave them the menu, and how they were going to cook, and what they were going to eat. And then they were going to celebrate that year after year after year after year, and they keep doing that today, precisely to make a memorial of what happened that night. And that is what Jesus did, and that is what we do every time we come to Mass, especially on Holy Thursday. So to understand the background of the Last Supper, we have to understand the Jewish Passover, which is what we read on the first reading. Now, to understand what actually happens, you know, in Hebrew this is called the Passover Seder, or the Pesach Seder. Seder in Hebrew means order, because it follows an order. This celebration, this Passover supper, Jewish families celebrate once a year, follows a ritual. It follows an order, a specific order of steps. And this order of steps is a ritual. This order of steps is what we call an ordinary. If you open the Missal, the Christian Missal, you will find the ordinary of the Mass, which means the order in which the liturgy is celebrated. Well, that tradition of celebrating according to an ordinary comes from here, from the Seder. And this Seder is a beautiful celebration in which families gather, and the youngest at the table asks the eldest, why is this night different from the rest of the nights? And he begins asking, because in the rest of the nights we can eat either leavened bread or unleavened bread, but tonight we only eat leavened bread. And then by answering those questions, the Seder unfolds. And the purpose of the Seder, again, is to make a memorial of what happened that night of liberation. So, every dish they eat, they consume, has a purpose. And the purpose is precisely for them to experience what happened that night so that they can partake of it. They experience what happened that night so that they can partake of it. The main dish is the lamb. God told them, you will eat a lamb, and you are not going to break any bone, you are just going to roast it. It has to be good enough in size for one family. If it is bigger for one family, then 2 families gather, but you have to eat it all. And this was the main dish, and it had a very specific purpose that I'm going to tell you in a minute. Another thing that is eaten on this Seder is the bitter herbs, which are called the maror. And the purpose of eating the bitter herbs is to taste the bitterness of the slavery. So that by tasting the bitterness of the slavery, they also become slaves. And the way the maror is eaten, the bitter herbs are dipped into water with salt, so that it tastes like tears. So they can taste the tears their ancestors shed when they were slaves in Egypt. So now they begin to taste, and by tasting, they begin to partake. They become now the actors of what happened that night. Then they eat a sauce that is called haroset. It is delicious, by the way. It is made with hashed apple and crumbled nuts and apple juice. It is delicious, and you actually eat it, you know, on top of the lamb, or with the unleavened bread. And maybe I will tell you next time, because next time when we talk about, or maybe not, or maybe tonight, because I have to talk about Judas, you know, because in the Gospel according to John, you remember what happened, right? That Jesus is sitting at the table, and the beloved disciple is sitting to his right, and then Judas is sitting to his left. So when Jesus announces he's going to be betrayed, Peter makes a signal to the beloved disciple, ask him, who is it? And Jesus tells the beloved disciple, whoever I give a piece of bread dipped in sauce, he's the one who will betray me. And he did that to Judas. You know that dipping the unleavened bread on the charoset and giving it to a guest, well, first of all, that was reserved only for the host of the banquet. And that gesture was not open to everyone. It was reserved to the guest of honor, to the most beloved one. And Jesus gave that piece of bread with the charoset to the most beloved one, and that happened to be the one who was about to betray him. That is very dramatic. That is very dramatic, but that is what happened there. So that is the charoset. And the purpose of the charoset, when you look at the charoset, it looks like clay. So the purpose is to remember the clay their ancestors used in Egypt to confect the bricks of the constructions when they were slaves. So by means of this meal, they bring the past to the present, and they reenact it, and they become actors of it. You see? And they keep the memory alive by partaking on it. And that is what Jesus was doing with his disciples. Another thing they eat is the egg. A boiled egg, a hard egg. And the reason for that is that at some point in history, the Hebrews were so poor that they couldn't afford a banquet. So the religious authorities allowed them to eat a boiled egg, and with that they will fulfill the prescription of the party. So they started eating that boiled egg, that Passover egg, that Easter egg. That is the origin of the Easter egg. Now you know. Then, another important thing was the unleavened bread. And this is beautiful, because that every year I gather with friends and we celebrate on Holy Week. We usually don't do this on the evening of Palm Sunday. This year I won't because I will be here. But we gather with several families, and we go through the Seder, and we cook the entire meal and everything, and then I lead it, and everybody has a small booklet that I have made, and I sing in Hebrew the blessings and everything. And I explain how that all connects to the Holy Mass. So for the people who go there, then they really understand the meaning of Mass, it's beautiful. So an important part, the most important, for us as Christians, the most important part is this, the unleavened bread and the wine. God told Moses that they were going to cook unleavened bread. Why? Well, first of all, because it was easy. They were in a rush. They didn't have time to bake a cake. So it was too easy to do this. You just flour and water, that's it. And with the heat in Egypt, they could even just put it on a stone and the sun would cook it. So it was something quick and easy. And that is what Jesus used to confect the Eucharist. That unleavened bread. That's why we eat unleavened bread at the Eucharist. And at the beginning of the supper itself, the person leading the Seder, everybody has, because you eat the Seder in different forms according to the ritual. At some point, you take the bitter herbs and you make a sandwich with the unleavened bread and with the herbs, and you eat it. And then at some point, a piece of the unleavened bread is hidden, and it is hidden that the children hide it. And then at the end of the supper, the host goes and looks for the hidden piece of bread. Probably there's a connection there between the hidden eggs and, I don't know, but that's something that they do. But the important thing about this unleavened bread is that everybody has unleavened bread on their plates, but there is a main piece of unleavened bread that the host breaks. He blesses the unleavened bread, he breaks it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives a piece to each. Even though they have their own piece of unleavened bread, at the beginning of the supper, everybody has to eat a piece of the bread the celebrant has blessed. Why is that? Why is that? So that they all eat the same. so that they are in communion, eating everybody the same. You know, think, and you know, we are humans, and God knows we are humans. And we have a way of expressing ourselves and of expressing our feelings towards each other, and even of feeling. Tell me if this is not the truth. Think of a friend who comes and has a chocolate bar. Maybe your favorite chocolate bar. If you don't like chocolate, think of your favorite candy, it doesn't matter. And he opens it and you, oh, you know, that's my favorite. And your friend says, okay, here it is, eat it, it's yours. Isn't it true that, yeah, we enjoy it, but at the same time we feel like uncomfortable, like uneasy, like guilty because we're taking it away from our friend? Even though we do not to offend him, but it is, I mean, it doesn't taste as well as it could. Now think of this other scenario in which your friend has 2 pieces of chocolate. And he takes one. And you say, oh, you know, that's my favorite. Oh, you know, I happen to have an extra one. Here it is. It tastes better, right? Now think of a third scenario, which is the best one. Your friend takes the chocolate bar, and you say, oh, you know, that's my favorite. And then he breaks it in 2 and gives you 1 piece, and he eats the other. Isn't that the sweetest chocolate, the loveliest chocolate you will ever eat? For the only reason that it was broken and shared. Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Well, that is what happens here. The celebrant of the Seder breaks a piece of bread and shares a little piece with everybody, and then they all eat of the same. And you know, when we break a piece of chocolate and when we split it and share, somehow we establish a sort of communion with our friend. Isn't that so? So that is what is happening by breaking this bread. And then, that's why when we read the gospel, we see that Jesus took the bread, said the blessing, broke it, and gave it to his disciples. He was doing the same, for the same purpose, and especially for him. He needed the apostles to be in communion with him. Why? Because he was going to die on a cross for them. He was going to die on a cross on their behalf. How could he take them to the cross with him if they were not in communion with him? The only possible way was for them to be in communion with him. How were they going to be in communion? By breaking bread and sharing it, so that they all ate the same. And it all came from the Passover Seder. But also, they drink 4 cups of along the celebration. 4 cups are drunk. And then every cup is blessed. You know, just a regular cup, but the celebrant blesses it every single time. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen, and then they all drink. Blessed are you, O Lord, King of the universe, for this wine which we have received. The same words Jesus used, the same words the priest uses to bless the bread and to bless the wine, they are taken from the Passover Seder. But the 4th one, the 4th cup, is the most important one, and the 4th cup is drunk after the supper is ended. Once the supper is ended, they take a special cup, a precious cup. Every family, no matter how poor they are, they have a special cup that is used, that is called the cup of blessing, and it is the 4th one to be used after the supper has ended. Have you seen that movie of Indiana Jones where he's looking for the how do you say that name from the Crusades? I mean, they're referring to the cup, to the chalice, but they call it, how do they call it? The Grail, the Holy Grail. Yeah, the Holy Grail. Yeah. And you know how that movie ends. You know, he walks on thin air or something, and then he finally gets inside a cave after running away from all sorts of traps and all that, and he gets, and apparently there are 3 cups or something, right? And if he grabs the wrong one, of course something is going to fall on them and kill them all. And there is a precious cup and some other cup, and there is a wooden cup, I think, very cheap. And everybody is thinking that he's going to grab the most precious one. but he actually gets the cheapest one, and that happens to be the Holy Grail. And then when they ask, how do you know this was the one? Oh, because this should be the cup of a poor carpenter. Well, he was completely nuts. I mean, if he was a teacher at Harvard, then he should be expelled, and his students should go and ask for them to give their money back, because that was completely wrong. Because no matter how poor they were, everybody had a precious cup reserved only for that moment. Reserved only for that moment. But that cup is blessed after the supper is ended. And you know, it is like a toast for the liberation of that night. It is the cup of blessing. Jesus, when the supper was ended, he took the chalice, and you know the rest. Well, this is it. It is And the thing about this is that when Jesus blessed that cup, he said, this is the cup, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. When the people of Israel were rescued from the slavery in Egypt, they walked in the desert and they finally got to Mount Sinai, where God established with them a covenant. You will be my people, I will be your God, remember? Now Jesus is going to set a new covenant. This one is going to be forever. And for all nations, not only for the Jews. But he's going to seal that covenant with his own blood. Now, I have spoken about all the different meals in the supper, in the Seder. But I haven't spoken about one that is very significant. The lamb. What is the lamb? Well, the lamb had a purpose that night. Remember that the Lord was going to send his angel to go through the city, killing the firstborns in every house. But then he said, with the blood of the lamb, you are going to stain the door of the houses. And with that will be the signal. So when the angel of the Lord goes through the city, when he sees a house that is marked with the lamb with the blood of the lamb, he will pass over that house and don't kill anybody. So the important thing about that lamb is that the blood of the lamb saved the people of Israel from death. The blood of the lamb saved the people of Israel from death. You know, keep that in mind. In the Last Supper account, we don't see a reference to the lamb. We see a reference to the bread, we see a reference to the sauce, we see a reference to the wine. But we don't see a reference to the bread, to the lamb. Well, it happens that when the time for the lamb was to be eaten, Jesus took a piece of bread and he said, this is my body. Well, what happens is that the blood of the lamb in Passover saved the Israelites from death. But Jesus happens to be the Lamb of God, whose blood saves us from eternal death. Jesus is the definite Lamb of God. Jesus is the true Lamb of God. He is the Lamb of God written with a capital letter L. He is the Lamb of God whose blood is going to save us from eternal death. So there's the connection between the Paschal Lamb and Jesus as the Lamb of God. And because the apostles were Jews, when they saw Jesus saying these words, they could make the connection. And they had heard that he was the Lamb of God before, so now they understand. Everything makes sense. This is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And that's why at Mass, before communion, the priest raises the consecrated host and the consecrated wine, and he says, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. We finish the first reading and we go to the responsorial psalm, because Mass is not a monologue in which we come to listen to God talking to us. It is a dialogue. We actually interact with God at Mass. So God takes as always the initiative and he talks to us first. But then after listening to him, we respond to God. And we respond with the responsorial psalm. That is our response to God. And we use a psalm to answer to God for two reasons. First of all, because, talking with God in human terms, our human words are limited. But if we borrow the word of God to talk back to God, then we respond to God with the Word of God, then our words can definitely reach heaven. But there is also another reason. The Psalms are prayers, but they are poems at the same time. The Psalms are poetry. And which is the language of the people who love? A poem. So we respond to God with a poem to express our love. We have heard the story of the Passover. And the way we respond to God in the responsorial psalm in this Mass is as follows. Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. We read Psalm 116, which is actually the psalm that is sung after the Passover is finished, from 116 to 118. We read Psalm 116, and the antiphon is this one. Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. And there you have our blessing cup, our blessing Christian cup, our chalice, but it makes a connection with the blessing cup of the Passover, you see? And that's how it is all connected. Now, we go to the second reading. Remember that in this Mass, we celebrate the institution of priesthood and the institution of the Eucharist. Well, we read that in the second reading, not in the Gospel, but in the second reading. Because there are three Gospels that talk about the institution of the priesthood and the institution of the Eucharist, which are the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Paul does the same on his first letter to the Corinthians, right? So Jesus institutes the Eucharist there. And he also institutes priesthood when he says, when he commands them to do the same as he has done. When he commands them to do the same, he is giving them the power to confect the Eucharist, and he institutes the priesthood there. So that's what we read on the second reading. And then we go to the Gospel. I'm not going to go into the details of the second reading because I think the institution of the Eucharist is something that we are familiar with, right? Of course, we could speak a full course on the institution of the Eucharist, but we're not going to do that tonight. Because I prefer to focus on the Gospel, because it is truly fascinating. What happens on the Gospel reading in the evening Mass of the Lord's Supper is just fascinating, but we have to understand it. The Gospel talks about the washing of the feet, which we find in the Gospel of John. The Gospel according to John is the only one that speaks about the washing of the feet. It doesn't speak about the institution of the Eucharist, but it talks about the washing of the feet. And it is a beautiful story. It is so beautiful that at Mass, the priest reenacts it. And this is how the Missal prescribes that this rite is celebrated. It says, those who are chosen are led by the ministers to chairs. Then the priest, removing his chasuble, goes to each with the help of ministers. He pours water over each one's feet and dries them. That is the way this rite is celebrated. And you know, it is a modern rite, if you will, because it was introduced into the liturgy after the Second Vatican Council in 1962. So it is a modern rite. Yet it is very powerful for what it represents. So to understand the meaning of the rite of the washing of the feet, you know, the enactment of the washing of the feet itself is optional. It is not mandatory. And you know that when it was prescribed, it was reserved for men alone because the apostles were men only. At some point in the United States, bishops started to give permission to wash the feet of men and women, but it was only here. Outside it was for men only. And it was 3 years ago that Pope Francis changed the rubric to include women as well. So now it is universal, the practice of washing the feet of men and women who are led by ministers to be sat on chairs so that the priest does it, the priest. And it is important that the priest does what Jesus did, and actually according to the rubrics there is no number, no specific number. The tradition is 12 because 12 were the apostles. So to understand the beauty and the power and the message behind the washing of the feet, we have to read it. And the reason I want to carefully review this with you tonight is because what I'm going to share with you tonight is my latest finding on the hidden treasures of Holy Week. Well, actually the second time, because I was on tour in Minnesota back in October, and that's where I shared it for the first time. But it's the first time I do it here in Washington, so you're the first in Washington to hear this. It happened that I was sitting on Holy Thursday. Well, actually not sitting, I was standing, because we were reading the Gospel. And I was paying attention to the sequence of events. And then, something that I hadn't seen before in years, and this is a Gospel that we read year after year after year after year on Holy Thursday. I started noticing something that I hadn't noticed before. And the people who came to this talk here last year didn't hear this story, because I actually found that a week later, or that same week, I think. So that's why you missed it, because I discovered that just a few days later. So I started to pay attention to the sequence in which the events of the washing of the feet were unfolding. And then I said, this looks rather peculiar to me. In the specific order of the events. I usually carry a notebook with me at Mass. It's hard sometimes, because sometimes when I read the Gospel and I sit to listen to the homily, don't do this yourself, don't do this at home. Because then you don't pay attention. But sometimes, not all the time, I promise not all the time, but yeah, many times I do. Because sometimes I find something interesting in one of the readings, and then I have to grab my notebook and begin writing my notes before I forget, and I have found many interesting things. So this was the case. So while the priest was washing the feet of the people, I didn't even pay attention because I was busy I was with my notebook writing and drafting the sequence of events, and I said, when I get home, I have to validate my theory. And then I got home and I opened the Bible and I validated my theory, and yes, I was right. In the sequence of the events, the events unfolded in the washing of the feet, we find the true message behind all this. So let's read the Gospel, pay attention to the sequence of the events. Then we are going to dissect the Gospel and go step by step and see what we can find. So come with me as we unearth a hidden treasure in the Gospel. Well, to me it was a finding, but I am positive that there are many scholars in Rome which already know this. But to me it was a personal finding, so it is always exciting. So now I'm going to reenact with you my findings, and you're going to be part of this adventure, and you will never forget it. Because if I only tell you what I found, but if you do it with me, then you will never forget. And when you come to Mass on Holy Thursday, it's going to be really different and special. So let's read it. Before the feast of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to pass from this world to the Father. He loved his Son in the world, and he loved them to the end. The devil had already induced Judas, son of Simon, the Iscariot, to hand him over. So during supper, fully aware that the Father had put everything into his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God, he rose from supper and laid down his outer garments. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with the towel around his waist. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Master, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing, you do not understand now, but you will understand later. Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me. Simon Peter said to him, Master, then not only my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus said to him, whoever has bathed has no need except to have his feet washed, for he is clean all over. So you are clean, but not all. For he knew who would betray him. For this reason he said, not all of you are clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken off his garments and reclined at table again, he said to them, Do you realize what I have done for you? You call me teacher and master, and rightly so, for indeed I am. If I therefore, the master and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do. Well, of course, when we read this story, and we know a bit of the background, we all know that this task was reserved to the slave in the house with the lowest rank. You know, back then it was fine to have slaves, and they were not actually, treated with a whip or anything. They were sometimes treated like even part of the family. The slaves with the senior ranks, they would become like the private secretaries of the masters of the house. But of course, the tasks that nobody wanted to do were left to the slave with the lowest rank. And one of them was washing the dirty feet of people as they came inside the house. The slave of the lowest rank. So when Jesus stands up and begins doing something that is reserved to the slave with the lowest rank, to the apostles, that is extreme. Because you are our teacher, you are our master, and you are treating us as if you were our slave, and not only our slave, but our slave with the lowest rank. And of course, what we see at the end is that Jesus says, I have given you a model to follow. Jesus is serving them to the extreme. And he wants to make that point, that he's serving them to the extreme, so in turn, they serve each other to the extreme. But is that it about this text? No. If you only read it from the top, of course, this is what you get, and that is right. But when you begin digging, then you find something very powerful. What's the message? To understand the message, we're going to make together a semiotics analysis. Semiotics analysis is one of the exegesis techniques. The exegesis is the branch of theology that focuses on the interpretation of the biblical texts. By the way, I have a talk. This is a small advertisement. I have a lecture and workshop called Methods of Exegesis in the Catholic Church, and I go one by one, and then we all together interpret the text using a field. So that's available for you. One day you can invite me, and I will be glad to share that with you. So we're going to use the semiotic, well, that's what I did. I used the semiotic analysis, and I used two approaches. First, the narrative analysis, and then the structural analysis. Which means, first of all, I had to analyze, and we're going to analyze the narration itself. And once we analyze the narration, we're going to focus on the structure it is written. And from that, we're going to get to the message behind this text. So, looking at the narrative, if we pay attention to the way things unfolded, we see that Jesus rose from the table, then he rises from the table, he lays down his garments, he washes the feet of the apostles, then he has a dialogue with Peter, then he finishes washing the feet, then he takes off his garments, and then he reclines at the table. That is the sequence of the events. Let's go one by one. The first thing he does is that he rises from the table. Well, isn't that obvious? Yes, it is obvious he had to rise from the table, but the fact that it is deliberately pointed out should catch our eye. Why is the evangelist writing about something obvious, an obvious step? Rising from the table. Well, let's see what happens next. It says that Jesus laid down his garments. Then, Jesus washes the feet. Then, we find a dialogue with Peter, like in between, like it breaks the story, but we find a dialogue, like somebody inserted it in the narration. And it is a lengthy dialogue. Then, Jesus finishes washing the feet. Pay attention to this. What is Jesus doing here? He's finishing washing the feet. What did he do before speaking with Peter? He washed the feet. That's what gave me the hint. that there was something behind this. Why? Because then I said, okay, so what happened next? And I suspected that what was going to happen next was that Jesus was going to take off his garments, and he did. Because what did he do before he began washing the feet? He laid down his garments. You see? There's a connection. There is a symmetry here in the way the story is narrated. You see? What did Jesus do in the beginning? He rose from the table. What does he do at the end? He reclines at the table. You see? There is a parallel. First, he rises from the table. At the end, he will recline at the table. After rising from the table, he lays down his garments. After reclining at the table, he takes off his garments. After laying down his garments, he washes the feet. Before taking off his garments, he finishes washing the feet. And then in between, we find a dialogue with Peter. You see? That's why I had to grab my notebook and begin drafting at last. I couldn't help it, otherwise I would forget. It was just too fascinating to let it go. Why is this important? Because this kind of structure is called a chiasm. A chiasm. Chiasms are structured this way. An idea at the beginning that has a notch at the end, then a second idea that has a notch in the idea second to last, and so forth. And then we find something in the middle. And in the Bible we find many chiasms, and in the Gospel according to John we find many chiasms. What is the importance of a chiasm? Well, a text or a narration was written in the form of a chiasm to serve two purposes. The first one, it was a mnemotechnical resource, which means it was intended to help people to memorize a text, to memorize a story. That makes it easier. You know, back then not everybody could have the scroll, so what they had to do was to memorize the Bible. So to memorize the writings, this helped a lot. That was the first reason for writing something in the form of a chiasm. But here is the thing that matters to us tonight. When you find a chiasm, the main message of the story lies at the very center of the chiasm. So, if we want to understand the message behind the washing of the feet, we have to see what happened at the center of that chiasm. At the center of the chiasm, we find the dialogue with Peter. Now we see why there is something there that seems to break the sequence of the events. Then it means that we have to pay attention to the dialogue with Peter if we want to get to the message behind the washing of the feet. So now we are forgetting about the narration, the narrative analysis. Now we are focusing on the structure. We detected a chiasm. When we go to see the dialogue between Peter and Jesus, we find that it is also deliberately structured in the form of three interlocutions. What is an interlocution? And this is a resource used abundantly in the Gospel according to John. In an interlocution, Jesus is talking to an interlocutor who talks to Jesus, and whatever the interlocutor says to Jesus gives Jesus the excuse to respond with a teaching. For instance, if in the Gospel according to John you read his encounter at night with Nicodemus, that encounter with Nicodemus is precisely developed as a sequence of interlocutions. Well, we find three interlocutions. Are you going to wash my feet? Then Jesus says, what I'm doing now you do not understand now. You will never wash my feet. Unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me. Not only my feet, then, but my hands and head as well. Whoever has bathed has no need except to have his feet washed. Now, because this lies at the center of the chiasm, out of these three, there is one that matters the most. And it is the one, of course, that lies in the middle. So we have to pay attention to this interlocution at the middle. You will never wash my feet. Unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me. That is the one we care about. Now, I said, okay, this matters. But why does it matter? So then I went once again to see step by step what was happening. And I found something really interesting. That it says explicitly that Jesus lays down his garments. And it also says explicitly that Jesus takes off his garments. Then I said, well, that actually matters. And I had always noticed how in the celebration of the washing of the feet at Mass, the priest removes his chasuble. And if you read the rubric, it says, those that are chosen are led by the ministers to church, then the priest, removing his chasuble, goes to each. So then I said, it is important the fact that the priest is actually removing his chasuble, because after washing the feet of the people, what does the priest do? He has to grab back his chasuble and put it on. So then that matters. So then I said, okay, what is the next step when you are stuck? The next step when you are stuck is that you go to the original text in Greek to see what it says. So when I went to see the gospel in Greek, I found that the phrase in Greek to talk about laying down the garments is titeni taimatia. Titisin taimatia lays down his garments. And then elaven taimatia. Taimatia means his garments, of course, right? So elaven takes up. Titisin lays down. So then I said, okay, these two verbs have to be important. Important enough that even the priest does the same. So then I looked in the Gospel according to John. Where else were these verbs used? And I found that there is only one verse, in addition to this story, where these two verbs are used. It is John 10:17. In John 10:17, Jesus says, this is why the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. And when you read the text in Greek, it says, Dia tutone, o pater agapa, o diego, titemi, tem sitin mo, ina palin lao autim. This is that, okay? It's exactly the same. But here you can see these two verbs that are used again when Jesus is washing the feet. Which means that titesin or titemi, which means lay down. Jesus is actually talking about laying down what? His life. But he doesn't only lay down, then he takes it up. Exactly with these verbs. Titemi, lavein. With titemin and with lavein, Jesus lays down his life and then he takes it down. Which means with these verbs, Jesus dies and then he resurrects. Jesus dies and then he resurrects. And with that same verbs of dying and resurrecting, Jesus takes out his garments and then puts them back up again when he's washing the feet. Which means that when Jesus takes out his garments and lay them down, that is an anticipation of his death. And when he takes them up, that is an anticipation of his resurrection. And that's why he tells Peter, unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance in me. Why not? Because what Jesus is doing by washing the feet, yes, he's serving them to the extreme. But this is actually a prophetic sign of the most extreme service. Because if it is extreme to you that I wash your feet, it doesn't compare to what I'm going to do for you next. That is extreme. I am going to die on a cross for you. That is extreme. So the washing of the feet, my friends, is a prophetic sign of the most extreme the Son of God will make for you and me, dying on a cross. The washing of the feet is an anticipation of his death and his resurrection. And we know that by paying attention to the verbs. And that explains why he told Peter, unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me. Because Peter, if you don't let me that I wash your feet, you are not, if this is too extreme to you and you don't let me, then you are not going to let me die on a cross for you. And if I don't die on a cross for you, you are not going to be saved. So unless I wash you, unless you let me die on a cross for you, you will have no inheritance with me. You see? The washing of the feet is a prophetic sign of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And actually the washing of the feet has three different dimensions that we can identify from all this. It has a pastoral dimension, that extreme service with a lesson for you. Love one another as I have loved you. Jesus will say later in his Last Supper account in the Gospel of John. The third thing we celebrate in this Mass is the institution of the commandment of love. How are we going to love each other? By serving each other to the extreme. And that is the pastoral dimension of the washing of the feet. But it also has a prophetic dimension, which is what we just discovered, that the washing of the feet is a prophetic sign of his dying and resurrecting. And of course, because of all this, it also has a salvific dimension. We must allow Jesus to serve us to the extreme. We must allow Jesus to die for us so that we can be redeemed. You see, everything that unfolds before our eyes every Holy Thursday, isn't that fascinating? And that's why in the Second Vatican Council, they said, you know, it would be good to reenact the washing of the feet because of everything that is represented in there. So now we see why the priest washes the feet of the people, because the priest is the one representing Jesus at the Last Supper. He is acting in persona Christi. And the people who go to the front, the people who go and sit, and they actually sit. Why do they sit? So that the priest serves them in persona Christi. In Holy Week, we are there not to serve. We are there to be served by the Lord. And we have to let him serve us. We have to forget that temptation of being the protagonists and the owners of the liturgical celebrations in the Triduum. No. We have to let Jesus serve us, and that's why he's telling them that. You have to let me serve you. You have to let me serve you. It's just beautiful. Then goes the homily, and according to the Missal, the homily should touch on these points: the institution of priesthood, the institution of the Eucharist, and the institution of law. The liturgy of the Eucharist is celebrated as usual. The interesting thing is that in consecration, enough hosts have to be consecrated for this Mass and for Good Friday, because Good Friday is the only day in the year where no sacraments are celebrated. Well, confession, of course, right? Or baptism in an extreme case. Other than that, there are no sacraments. There is no Mass. Good Friday is the only day in the year where there is no Mass. Why there is no Mass? Because God is dead. So on Good Friday, and we will talk about that next time, on Good Friday, we don't have a Mass, but we have a liturgy, the liturgy of the Lord's Passion. And in the liturgy of the Lord's Passion, it has a communion service. And the communions we receive were consecrated on the Mass of the Lord's Supper. You see? Then, the Blessed Sacrament is transferred, and it is exposed for a vigil of adoration. And that represents the prayer of Jesus in Gethsemane. And we are there keeping watch, praying with him that night. That's what we do. When the liturgy itself comes to an end, we are left with a sense of emptiness. You can see how the altar is stripped. The tablecloths are removed. The candles are taken. The crosses are also removed. And something that is very dramatic, and especially when you come on Good Friday, is to see the tabernacle open and empty. When you come to church on Good Friday, you don't have to make a genuflection because there is no God. It is empty. He's dead. When you come on Good Friday, you don't have to bow at the altar because there's no Mass. I mean, God is dead. And next time when I speak about the death of God, you will see how people usually don't take that as seriously as they should. But all this is meant to give us the idea, to send us the message, Jesus is dead. There is no Mass. It's empty. So don't genuflect. There is no Jesus. And also, there is no blessing, but there is no blessing for a reason. And this is something very funny, because you can see that when this liturgy comes to an end, many people are like, oh, he probably forget to give us a blessing, and then they make the sign of the cross and leave. Don't. There is no blessing for one single reason. This is not over yet. Remember that the Triduum is a single mystery that unfolds in 3 episodes. This will be over when Jesus resurrects, but it is not over yet, so there is no blessing. There is no blessing. And with this, we come to the end of our talk tonight. But if you have any question, I will be glad to answer. Of course, if I know the answer. If I don't, I won't. But I can write it down and then tell you next time. Any questions, anybody? No? Really? When I have no questions, it is either because you understood it all, or because you don't understood nothing, and that's because I didn't put you explaining it. So, well, if you go, yes, one question, yes. Good, so, thank you.
So I sing at Triduum, and can you comment on the music that's played during the Holy Thursday?
The music, well, in the case of the music, of course the chants have to be...
Could you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, the question was that what about the music in the Triduum or in
Holy Thursday? In
Holy Thursday, yeah, in Holy Thursday. So well, the music, I mean, just follow the chants that are in the book, right? They just have to match what is unfolding here in the celebration. There is a beautiful one that I will play at the end, and you will recognize it. And that is very traditional actually for communion. As a communion song, it is beautiful. When I play it at the end, because I was planning to play it as you leave, but you will see which one it is, and that's it. I mean, you know, one of the things about something we have to never forget is that Holy Week is a very solemn time. And don't confuse celebration with party, because it is not a party. And Mass is never a party, it is a celebration. And you can see now how serious it is, because we are making a memorial of the Last Supper, just as Jesus and the apostles made a memorial of the Passover. You see? Now you understand. We celebrate Mass in order to recall something from the past, bring it to the present, so that we can partake of it. That's what we do. See? And we have, our liturgical tone is in accordance to what we are celebrating. So, for example, on Good Friday, there is no music. On the entrance procession, it is actually very dramatic. It is in complete silence, and when the priest gets to the altar, he prostrates himself. I will explain why he prostrates next time, but he does. And we're in silence. It is a sad day. It is the saddest day, because that is when Jesus died. We are mourning. And there are some people who don't get this, and they tell you, Happy Good Friday. How can you wish me a Happy Good Friday when this is... It is like if you go to the funeral of my father and you tell me, Happy Funeral. It is exactly the same. It is exactly... And you know, when we speak about Good Friday next time, I am sure that when you leave, your appreciation of what happens on Good Friday is not going to be ever the same. So, but then we have an Easter Vigil. That is the time of joy, and at some point when we sing the Gloria and the lights come up and the bells ring again, and then we explode in joy because Jesus has resurrected. That is the time. But this time is You know, for instance, on that procession with the Blessed Sacrament, when the liturgy finishes, we have to sing the Tantum Ergo, which is beautiful. And there are no bells anymore, so the tradition, I don't know, you have a clapper here, but the tradition is to make that procession with a clapper, you know, clack, clack, clack. And you have to know how to play the clapper, because there is a way to play the clapper. If you have a clapper here, fine. If you don't, you still have a few weeks to get one. But, but as you process with the Blessed Sacrament, singing the Tantum Ergo, this is how you play the clapper. And you hear that, and it's very powerful, actually. And you realize that something is happening that is not bells anymore. And you mark the rhythm like that. And it sounds powerful, and that it adds, just as music adds some feeling to what is unfolding, the clapper serves that purpose of, you know, this is serious. Jesus is about to die. He's going to the garden, and he's even going to sweat blood. So we have to be attentive to that. And our tone, our spiritual demeanor has to match what is happening, and music likewise. Any other question? Yes?
Let me give you the mic here.
I believe that you said that the scriptures of John were the only one that had the washing of the feet.
Yes.
And why is it that the other three Gospels don't?
You know, whenever I find, I will tell you, because that's, you know, see. And for instance, he doesn't mention the institution of the Eucharist in his Last Supper. And in his Last Supper, Jesus delivers 3 farewell discourses. Not only one, but 3. You know, so, see, this is what happens. You have to remember that the Gospel according to John, differently from the Synoptics, is not really a biographical Gospel like the others, right? The other 3 Gospels, in a way, develop the biography of Jesus and his teachings behind, right? The Gospel according to John, which was written at the end, long time later, it was actually a theological reflection on what Jesus did and what he said. So then they compiled a series of written reflections, theological reflections. They put them all together and they link them so that it sounds like a story. So in the Gospel of John, we see things different sometimes than what happens in the Synoptics, which they are called Synoptics because if we put them side by side at a glance, Synopticos in Greek with the eyes, they look the same. The other one doesn't. For example, in the Synoptics, when Jesus reaches Jerusalem for the last time, he enters Jerusalem, he goes to the temple and he cleanses the temple. Right? And then the Passion begins. In the Gospel according to John, that is the first public thing Jesus does. He cleanses the temple and then he dies 3 years later after going back to Jerusalem 3 more times. You know? Of theological reflection. So, in chapter 6, in the Gospel according to John, you will find all the theological reflection about the Eucharist. That is where you find the discourse of the bread of life. And because John has already covered on the theology of the Eucharist, he doesn't cover it again when he gets to the Last Supper. Right? Why was this missed by the Synoptics? I don't know. You know, see, the thing is that when you, even when you go and you get home, and you begin talking about this talk, I am sure that everybody will tell the story differently. But all of you will tell the same. But there is something that grabs your attention more than somebody else's. And you will probably emphasize that when you tell your friend about what you learned today. But someone else is going to tell perhaps something different, right? And you will probably forget something that somebody else will remember. And in the end, you will all tell the same. But you will do it your own way and according to what was more relevant to you or more impactful. And that's how the Gospels were composed also, in a way, right? It's more complex than that. But that played a lot on the way they were written. So, you know, this was a significant aspect for John, and he he added it to his narration, to his narrative, the others didn't. But you know, why they didn't, I cannot tell you. You know, it's an interesting question, but yeah, I have wondered that myself, but I don't have an answer. Yeah. Any other question? Any other question? No? Yes, you have a question.
I have one. So I was wondering if you could comment on Scott Hahn's theory about the Last Supper that he expounds in the fourth cup, where he talks about the idea that Jesus only drinks 3 cups at the Last Supper, and so he leaves the Last Supper with the Seder meal essentially unfinished, and it is finished when he's on the cross, and that he drinks the fourth cup when he's offered wine on the cross, so that in a way the fourth cup finishes the Seder when he is about to say it is finished on the cross, when he breathes his last, that is to say with his death. He identifies with the lamb, that is the Seder lamb. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know that when Jesus sits at the table with the apostles, he says that he's no longer going to eat from the Seder. He's not going to eat from that banquet anymore, right? So it is as he's opening his banquet, but he himself is not finishing it yet, because he's going to finish it at the cross, right? There are different opinions about that. Some people say that he will drink the cup when he sits with his Father in heaven. Some others think that he will drink that cup when he drinks the gall and vinegar that are offered to him at the cross. Some others say that he actually drank it he drank it by pouring his own blood and by setting a new covenant by pouring his blood on the cross. So there are different opinions about that. I don't think there is a definite one, because even in his masterwork, Jesus of Nazareth, of Joseph Ratzinger, which he wrote when he was Pope Benedict, but he signed it not as the Pope, he signed it as Joseph Ratzinger, the theologian. He writes about this and he presents different theories, but he doesn't conclude on any one in particular. So I think that's rather open. We will have to wait and ask Jesus in heaven. So what did you mean by drinking this? It's different opinions on that. Yeah. And I don't incline to anyone in particular. I mean, I honestly don't have an opinion. Yeah. Any other question? Yes. Okay. There's one and there's one more here. Yes.
It's just when the Jewish people celebrate Passover, do
Uh-huh.
they not drink the fourth cup then?
Sorry?
When the Jewish people celebrate Passover, do they drink the fourth cup of wine?
Oh, yes, they do. They do. Yeah, they do. They do drink it. To date, in fact, the Jewish families, they also have a cup of blessing at home, and they do bless the cup of blessing when it is over. Yeah, they do. Mm-hmm.